Great. Well, I suggest we get started. So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us, whether you're here today live or you're listening to this recording in the future. Thank you very, very much for joining this session. So this is part of a global movement that we have at the Consumer Goods Forum on working together towards net zero and deep diving into accelerated learning on commodity decarbonisation. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with the team of experts from Pepsico, where we're going to give you insights into the work that they have been doing on, in particular, potatoes and potato sourcing. So I'll just uh, before we get started, as with all things CGF, when we get to the Q&A section of today's session, we will respect, obviously, the Consumer Goods Forum antitrust caution statement. So a big thank you to everyone for respecting that. So who do I have with me today? So this is the third session. Again, so if you're looking at this live or in the future, this is the third. We have a library of masterclasses available on our website. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by three great experts. So do take the time and the opportunity to engage with them throughout this session. So very warm welcome to Archana, who, along with being the Chief Sustainability Officer of PepsiCo in Europe, actually co-chairs globally the Towards Net Zero Coalition of Action. So Archana, a huge thank you. Who's joined by Margaret, who's the Vice President of Sustainable and Regenerative Agriculture, and Stephen, who's the Senior Director of Potatoes in North America. So a brilliant team of experts who are going to bring us through the challenges, the opportunities, and the solutions and the levers that they have found to accelerate decarbonisation of this commodity supply chain. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Archana to kick off today's session. And please do think about your questions, which we will either reach today or we'll follow up after today's session. So Archana, I will hand it over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join, and also for those who are listening back to this webinar later. We have some fantastic content, so please ask questions as you go along, and we look forward to the Q&A at the end as well. So pretty much similar to other commodity masterclasses that we've held as part of the CGF community going in the past, we will start with providing a little bit of an overview on, the context of potatoes, some of the regional specificities. But then we'll really spend a bulk of the time talking about solutions and case studies and what we found in our experience works for us. And I'm delighted that I'm joined by Margaret and Stephen, who have a huge amount of expertise and have provided their valuable time to help share that with us. We will not be recording the Q&A. For those who are listening back, we will end at the main presentation section. So we move on ahead. Let me just give you a quick overview of PepsiCo before I hand over to Margaret and Stephen to talk about potatoes and agriculture in particular. So we are a huge multi-billion-dollar food and beverage company. So $91 billion was 2023. And we have enormous scale. So we operate across 200 plus countries, across over 1,000 manufacturing sites with several iconic brands, not just on the beverage side, so Pepsi, 7-Up, Gatorade, Aquafina, but also on the food side. So a lot of people don't associate PepsiCo with our food brands. We are well known for being a beverage company. But we also have several multi-billion-dollar iconic brands. We produce Lay's, Doritos, Quaker, Sunbite, several brands that many of you, regardless of which country you are joining in from, will hopefully know and recognize. So we move on to the next page. Let me just give an overview of our sustainability agenda. And really for us, Pep Positive is our strategic end-to-end transformation. And it really places sustainability at the center of how we think we want to grow and create value in the future. And we have three vectors or three pillars for how we think about this. The first one, and this is what we'll talk a lot about today, is positive agriculture. And this is really about how we work to source our crops in a way that is regenerative. So, really, in a way that restores the earth, strengthens farming communities, decarbonizes the food system, and creates a more sustainable food system for the future. And we'll talk a lot more about that today. But let me quickly touch on the other two as well. So, positive value chain is our second pillar. And this is really about building a circular, inclusive value chain, including sustainable packaging, includes our goals on decarbonization and our goals on building inclusivity within the value chain. And then finally, as a big consumer business, we touch billions of consumers through our products every day, every year. And so we want to inspire people through our brands to make choices that are better for people and better for the planet. And so the third pillar of our strategy is really around positive choices. So today we'll talk a lot about positive agriculture and what we're doing, particularly in the decarbonization space. We'll touch less on regenerative agriculture, sustainable sourcing, and some of the other elements of agriculture that are critical to us as well. So with that, let me hand over to our experts, Margaret and Stephen, and hopefully you find the discussion enlightening, but also request you to put any questions in the chat, and we can come to that in the Q&A.
Thank you, Archana. I will just touch on agriculture overall for PepsiCo in one slide, and then we're going to dive into potatoes. So for PepsiCo overall, you may say, oh, why is PepsiCo talking about agriculture? Well, we source 35 different crops from over 60 different countries. And so we're really very grounded in those agricultural communities all around the world. We're spreading regenerative agriculture on over 7 million of those acres within our agricultural footprint. In 2023, reported progress in just 2 years to reach 1.8 million of those acres already, where we've engaged with groups that are working with those farmers. We've seen uptake of those regenerative practices across those farms with the associated carbon impacts, with the associated biodiversity improvements, watershed health improvements, soil health improvements. Some of the ways that we're doing that are through our demonstration farms, where we have farmers who are taking up some of the innovative practices that can help to drive that agenda forward. And today we're going to talk to some of those specifically in potatoes, where we have tens of thousands of potato farmers specifically worldwide. And so with that, let's dive into potatoes a little bit. And first we'll ground you in the context, and then we'll talk about some specifics. So Stephen, do you want to start us off with some context on potatoes?
Sure will. Thanks, Margaret. Here's, for those of you that aren't quite as familiar with the potato footprint globally, here's a high-level picture for you. About $130 billion in revenue being transacted around the globe. About 374 million metric tons of potatoes are produced annually.
I was wondering where you guys went. Are you hiding?
Thanks. And over on the right-hand side, you see the top 7 countries, and you see a fairly big range and maybe a couple of surprises there, just on the overall size of potatoes, and how that stacks up across the globe. Here's an interesting slide around potato movements, if you will. And so potatoes have some interesting characteristics. Number one, they're grown in dirt. Number two, they happen to be alive and respirating until you process them, in most cases. And so as a result of that, you've got quite a few phytosanitary requirements, which make them somewhat difficult to move around, if you will. So you don't want disease being transferred from one location to another location. So quite a complex bit of business there. So you don't see as many flows as you maybe were expecting. And you may see some unexpected flows on this map as well, or some really specific reasons for those. I think is from where you sit, if you have potatoes in your operation, if you have potatoes in your retail environment, you will want to start to get your head wrapped around, where are your potatoes being sourced from? Are they import? Are they domestic? Are they marketed locally, or is it from a further distance? And the reason for that, as we'll move into later, is that the footprint, carbon footprint, the sustainability footprint is very different market to market. We'll take a look at that subsequently.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about carbon overall in potatoes and what are the drivers of emissions, first, it's good to start out with the context globally that potatoes are 4.5% of global agricultural emissions. So that's, not small potatoes. Sorry for the joke early in the morning, couldn't resist. And if you break that down into what are the sources of it, there's some that are very static, like packaging. There's others that what Stephen just said really comes to light when you break this down, which is about localization and understanding where are your potatoes produced in the ground and where do they end up and what happens in between. So there's the on-field piece, which is that big 64%, which is also extremely variable depending on what kind of soil you're growing them in, what kind of machinery you use. All of those things vary dramatically if you're thinking about a half a hectare plot in India or several thousand acre farm, potentially in, say, North America. So there's many, many different ways to grow potatoes. And so that agriculture piece is extremely variable. And getting into it is one of the first things that many companies do when they're looking at their potato supply chain and their opportunities for decarbonization. Another to really focus on is storage. And this is about really where you're growing potatoes and when you're using them. If you're shipping potatoes directly from the farm and processing them immediately, obviously you're not having these storage emissions. In many of the warmer climates, there's a very significant storage portion where that cooling burden could be much higher than 20% of the footprint. So that storage component is the one that's going to vary dramatically as well, depending on where you are and how your potatoes flow. Now let's look at a couple of the real challenges for decarbonization of potatoes. We've talked about storage on this slide, which is very significant in potatoes in certain places. If you're looking at the on-field portion, there's a lot of different challenges on this page, and you'll see the ones with the orange check marks are really high impact for potatoes. Others are absolutely present for potatoes as well, but I'm just going to hone in on a couple of these ones that are very significant. I think for a lot of the crops that you're going to see these master classes for, there's some common challenges like measurability. Where are you modeling carbon based on practices? Where do you measure? How much data do you need from farmers to have enough of a confidence that the practices being put in place are leading to the decarbonization that you want? These are common challenges across crops. If you dive into potatoes, however, they don't get as much attention as some of the other crops. They don't get as much financing when you look at global flows of financing for regenerative agriculture. They're not quite as top of mind for many of those global organizations that are doing some of the funding and looking at landscape level solutions, et cetera, as they probably should given the opportunities. So bringing to light some of those opportunities, bringing to light the urgency of these solutions in potatoes is one of the things that we want to do today. And we'll dive into specific things that can be done on farm, but these are some of those trends of challenges that certainly touch potatoes and are really important. I also want to dive into one here, the high upfront carbon reduction costs. Potatoes are a relatively high value crop in many places. And so the risk that a farmer takes when they make a practice change can feel extraordinarily significant for many of these farmers. And so it depends on your region and how diversified your farmers are in their income stream. But potatoes are pretty specific. So if there's a heavy dependence on the potato income, there's a lot of considerations to put in place as you're embarking on a decarbonization plan and making sure it can be successful. That's our context. And now we'll get into some of the regional specificities, and I'll pass it back to Stephen, our deep potato expert.
Thanks, Margaret. A couple of slides here just to give you some regional context. Again, looking at the 7 countries that we highlighted earlier. This is one, again, where you really want to understand your value chain and where you're sourcing your potatoes from, or if you're selling potato products, French fries or something that's already been processed, where are they being produced becomes important. You'll see a fairly wide range here across productivity. So the up to 49,000 kilograms per hectare as a high in the US, and down as low as 16,000 kilograms is the number out of China right now, and sort of everything in between. And then you can see the size of each of those markets down below, as we highlighted before. And as Margaret highlighted, the carbon intensity and the investment in potatoes is relatively high. And you really need to think about it from an intensity standpoint, which is the very bottom number. And so you think about, you may have a very high productivity in a market, but you also want to understand how many inputs it took to make that. So getting it down to an intensity, and as you're understanding your supply chain, is important. Here's another look at this. I would just highlight a couple of things, in some specific markets. Again, understand your local dynamics, regulatory environments. You want to think about things like, are you pulling off of irrigated land, non-irrigated land? To Margaret's earlier point, are you pulling from storages or not? Those are important. And then what's your mix potentially of raw potatoes? Say you're in the retail business, you'll have in your produce section, raw potatoes that people are taking home to cook as they see fit. And then you'll also be selling processed potato products. And those could have very different supply chains that you'll want to think about. When you come across and look at this, as an example, US is fairly large scale, and you can get a lot done on one farm. And in contrast, if you were in Bangladesh, a lot of smallholders. You can need a very different approach in how you think about solutions in each of those contexts, not unlike other commodities that are going to get talked about inside this class. You're going to want to think about, what does the industry look like? Industry associations, how are the farmers organized? Do you have co-ops? Do you not have co-ops? When you think about your theory of change. And we're going to pivot now and move on into some of the solutions, if you will. So we'll take a quick look at some levers for decarbonization, and then move ourselves into a couple of the case studies that we brought for you today. I'm not going to drain all this slide. Margaret talked earlier about some of the factors for consideration across this category of potatoes. I'll touch on a few. The first one, yield optimization, is almost always a good thing to do. So it has high impact. It tends to be a stacked win for growers. So when you can drive up your utilization, effective utilization of inputs, and have good yield optimization, it's often more cost efficient for you to do that. Having reduced or low carbon fertilizer is an option that gives you a nice return on carbon. You need to really look at the ROI. Those aren't always cheap, and you can be thinking about means of nutrition for the crop that aren't necessarily synthetic fertilizer, and that often helps them. There's some very interesting solutions out there globally. Renewable electricity, we'll talk a little bit about today. When you talk about the expected return for farmers, that one really is, it depends. It depends on what may be available for subsidies in a market or in a jurisdiction to put in things like solar. It may also depend on how your utility partner handles net metering when it comes time to sell electricity back to the grid. So you really need to do your homework on that one as you go forward. Precision agriculture, where you have the ability to do that, where you have farms at scale and you can make that jump, is often a savings. Reduced number of inputs for the same units of output, which is a good thing. And then soil disturbance. We know that low soil disturbance is good for soil health. We know it's good for helping to sequester and hold carbon. Potatoes grown in the dirt, inherently makes that more difficult. So you really need to do your homework on that as you go forward. And from an applicability standpoint across these same levers, when you look across key markets, just a couple of things to highlight there. On the reduced and low carbon fertilizer, is it even available? How do you think about effective nitrogen use efficiency and nitrogen cycling in your crops? And again, how might you think about supporting or being able to do with less synthetic fertilizers and certainly lower carbon fertilizers at the end of the day? I already talked a little bit about precision agriculture and its scalability, and then soil coverage, maybe if I go all the way down to the bottom, is one that you can really think of as being effective across all markets, across all agriculture, really. How do you think about living root and managing your soil well as you go forward? Here are the 3 case studies we're going to cover off today. I'll take the first 2 and I'll pass it over to Archana to finish this up here. Renewable electricity we're going to touch on, reduced soil disturbance, and fertilizer optimization. On renewable electricity, so again, you want to understand what your footprint looks like, but as Margaret alluded to, in a number of temperate regions, as you go and get yourself into snow and frost lines and things like that, you're obviously not growing potatoes year round, so you're into storage situations. If you're closer to the equator, if you're going to keep potatoes, you're going to be keeping them under refrigeration. So potatoes do not like the tropics very much. So you really need to look and understand what that footprint looks like, where you do have a high electrical footprint, often for storage. How might you address that? We've had some really interesting work underway. We've piloted this in North America. We've got about 35% of our supply, with this in place, from the pilot that we've done in 2023 and 2024, where we've been using renewable electricity in a number of different forms, been able to offset that electrical footprint that we have on the farm. Quite often, those are quite cost-effective ways to do it, and it's also what we would consider a AA bond, meaning once you have it in place, there's no sort of leakage, if you will. There's no erosion of that. It's a 1-for-1. You have a low carbon electrical source. The carbon or the electricity that you're then using on farm, has that associated lower footprint with it. So those are really nice and solid programs, if you will. Over on the right-hand side, I think is a really important point for us from a policy standpoint, how we engage with governments and how we work with farmers and growers in this space. We have a clear line that says we do not want to support renewable electricity solutions that take away Class 1 or Class 2 ag land, which in the United States Department of Agriculture soil classification is really just saying those are your prime, the top 2 types of soil, meaning you could grow potatoes on them or most any other crop, if you will. So they aren't marginalized. You can grow, they're highly productive, and we don't want to lose Class 1 and Class 2 ag land for renewable energy projects. There are lots of other places to do it. You can move them into urban or suburban settings, where you have a lot of surfaces that are artificial anyway. You can put them on lands that are more marginalized. But how do you keep them off of Class 1 ag land, Class 1, Class 2 ag land? That really is our food source as we go forward, and obviously an important one for us. The second one we wanted to highlight here is, how do you think about managing your soil disturbance well inside of a potato production system? I'll maybe describe the picture on the left-hand side here. Very interesting. Here's a situation where the farmer in the previous fall. So prior, call it 6 months prior to planting, they went out and they pre-hilled their field. So they formed the beds that the potatoes were going to be planted into and simultaneously planted a cover crop that started growing. It overwintered and started growing again in the spring. And now you see them here planting directly into that cover crop. So got a number of good practices going on inside this picture. You've got fewer passes because they did the pre-hilling and the seeding in one pass in the fall prior. You had ground cover, at the end of the previous crop all the way through to the next planting, which is good for soil health. You also have some carbon sequestered there with what you're able to grow with the cover crop. And now you're making another single pass without any additional soil disturbance beyond what's absolutely necessary to get the potatoes into the ground. So some really nice, some practices captured in one picture there. And some of this work, on fewer passes, less fuel, less soil disturbance, really have been important for us. One thing that has helped drive adoption and growers going to make solutions like this come to light is measuring their carbon footprint. So we've taken the time to know and measure the carbon footprint of every farm that we have in the US and Canada, which has been really, really powerful. So there's a feedback loop and an engagement model, if you will. We've been encouraging best practices between growers, which has been brilliant. They come up with the most creative solutions, quite honestly. And then how do we recognize and support, that continued growth and development? I'll build it out a little bit more on the right-hand side. In this picture, you see potato planting going straight into what was a cotton crop. So the cotton's been harvested. They're coming in and planting directly in with potatoes. And what I'll call out, there's a large yellow container that you'll see on the right-hand side of the picture. It's actually attached to the tractor, and that's liquid fertilizer. So again, they've found a way to have fewer passes through the field, less disturbance. They're putting on liquid fertilizer as they're planting that potato crop, if you will. And again, they're really thinking about fewer resources, less disturbance, fewer passes through the field, if you will, and making good use of living root all year round. There's one acronym I realize I didn't correct for in the slide. CFT recognition. We use Cool Farm Tool as a carbon calculator. There are lots of carbon calculators out there, so that happens to be the one that we're most comfortable with and we tend to use. But again, the key concept here is to have one, be employing one, and to use that with your growers and for yourself to measure progress and move your agenda ahead when it comes to managing carbon and reducing and removing carbon from your value chain. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Archana to bring us home on our final case study.
Great. So third case study we're going to talk about is fertilizer. Let's roll the video first, and then I'll come back and talk about it. Hopefully this works.
Archana, I had just a bit of a moment. I'm not sure that I shared with audio, so I'm going to start this. Holler at me if it's not working.
Okay. It's not working, but there are subtitles on the screen, so.
Would you like me to restart it? Apologies.
No, I think there's subtitles, so let's just
okay.
Go ahead.
Very good.
My key learning there is sound has a big impact on your comprehension of video, but we'll keep that in mind for next time. So I just wanted to sort of reinforce three things that were talked about in that video. First is, why is this important, right? And you saw a stat there that said, based on our assessment, based on Cool Farm Tool, etc., we think on average 50% of the on-farm emissions can come for a crop like potatoes can come from fertilizer. And so it is a huge lever as you think about how do you decarbonize the on-farm emissions for a crop like potatoes, but equally it is relevant for most agricultural commodities. The percentages might differ, but it is likely to be very relevant for most agricultural commodities. So thinking about fertilizer is critical. Secondly, and Stephen alluded to this before, there are lots of technologies that we see out there in the marketplace on low carbon fertilizers. So there were a couple that were alluded to in the video. The first one is low carbon organic fertilizer. So this uses waste products like potato peels to actually make organomineral fertilizer. And then the second one, which again was referenced in the video, is green ammonia fertilizers, which basically use renewable electricity rather than natural gas to generate the ammonia that then makes the fertilizer. And both of these are low carbon solutions. There are several fertilizer companies in the marketplace that are driving the adoption of low carbon solutions, both startups and innovative companies, as well as the big fertilizer players like the Yaras and Fertiberias of the world. At PepsiCo, what we're doing is we're sort of engaging with all of these fertilizer companies, and we recently concluded a 7-year agreement with Yara to provide fertilizers for our crops in Europe, across the region. What's really interesting, and this brings me to the third point, is this is not just about replacing 1 ton of traditional fertilizer with 1 ton of green fertilizer. There's a real opportunity here to think about what we call nutrient use efficiency. So, what is the optimal diet for the plant? So, what's the nitrogen dosing? How much fertilizer should you apply? When should you apply? How should you apply? Etc. And so in that partnership with Yara, what Yara brings to the table is obviously the digital tools and the knowledge of nutrient dosing that can really help farmers think about how and when and how to be more efficient in the application of that fertilizer. And as you probably glean from Margaret and Stephen, we have the relationships with the farmers and a lot of the data on the crop that allows us to then be very synergistic and think about how do we reduce the nutrient use efficiency, or how do we increase the nutrient use efficiency while still using lower carbon fertilizers and therefore reducing the overall fertilizer footprint of the crop. So that in a nutshell is some of the work that we've been doing on fertilizers, which we believe will have a big impact on the overall carbon footprint of the crop. So I think that's the end of our tell section, so to speak. Sharon, I think when we stop recording,
Yep.
I see there's a couple of questions in the chat already. We can stop recording and then go on to the Q&A and have a discussion around some of the questions that have been posed.
Brilliant. Thank you. And everyone who's listening to this afterwards, thank you very, very much. And don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions if you're not with us here live today.